somewhere in the cold dark between stars, there is a name that outlived the man who bore it, spoken in ports and prisons and palaces alike, whispered by smugglers as a warning and by children as a prayer. A boy without parents, without a home, without even a name of his own, would one day stand at the center of a galaxy's war and die for the one thing he never learned to say aloud. But that is the end of the story, and you are not ready for the end. Not yet. Come closer, dear listener. Let your shoulders fall from your ears. Let the blankets settle over you like dust over an old, forgotten world. Close your eyes if you have not already, and let your breathing slow to match the hum of engines you have never heard, in ships that do not exist, in a galaxy far removed from the one cradling you now. Tonight is not for staying awake. Tonight is for drifting, slowly, into a story older than memory, though it will be told to you as though it happened only yesterday, in a place both impossibly far and strangely, achingly familiar. This is a story of a smuggler, a scoundrel, a liar, a thief, a man who trusted no one because no one had ever given him reason to. It is also, though he would have spat at the word, a story of love. It is a story of a boy who ran so that he might one day stop running and never quite managed it. It is a story that begins in gutters and ends among the stars, as so many of the great ones do. And, if you listen closely, you will hear in it the echo of other stories, older ones, about apprentices and masters, about empires and rebellions, about the terrible cost of belonging to no one, and the terrible cost of belonging to someone completely. Let the galaxy blur at its edges. Let the names of planets and ships wash over you like static, like starlight, like the murmur of an old recording played once too often to count. You do not need to remember all of it. You only need to let it in. Somewhere far from here, on a world of rust and rain and rising towers, a child is about to be born into hunger, though no one will trouble themselves to record the date. He will grow up fast and hard, in shadows cast by men crueler than the darkness itself. And he will not know, not for many years, that history has already reserved him a name. That name is Han Solo. Let it settle into you now, gently, like the first line of a myth you have always somehow known. Sleep, if you wish, or simply drift. Either way, the story will carry you. There is an old and terrible truth, repeated in 1,000 tongues across 1,000 systems, and it is this: freedom and destiny are not opposites, though the young believe them to be so, and though the old spend their lives learning otherwise. Destiny is a chain forged before birth, and freedom is the illusion that the chain can be broken by will alone. Every world has its version of this lesson, whispered by dying priests, carved into the walls of temples that no longer stand, sung by mothers to children they cannot protect. To be free, truly free, unmoored from home and blood and name, is to belong to no one, and to belong to no one is its own kind of prison, cold and vast and echoing. This is the price rarely spoken aloud, though it is paid in every corner of the galaxy, by every soul who has ever run from a place too small to hold their hunger. Roots are not chosen. They are planted in us by hands we do not choose, in soil we do not choose, under skies that will one day close over us like a lid. And yet there are those, rare and doomed, who tear themselves loose from that soil entirely, who let the roots wither so that nothing may hold them, so that no god or gang or government may ever again decide their fate for them. They call this freedom, they are, of course, only half right. For a life lived without roots is a life lived without shelter, and a man who belongs to nothing may run forever, faster than fear, farther than shame, and still find himself standing alone at the end of it, in the ash and the wreckage, wondering what exactly it was he ran so hard to save. This is not a story about escape, though it will look like one for a very long time. It is a story about the terrible, quiet arithmetic of belonging, what it costs to have none, what it costs to want it anyway, and what it costs, in the end, to find it and lose it and find it again, over and over, until death finally balances the ledger. Every legend begins as a debt. Every hero is, in some sense, a runaway, paying it off. And every man who tells himself he needs no one is, more often than not, a man who has simply not yet met the person who will prove him wrong. Long before he had a name that history would remember, there was a debt already accruing on a world that did not care what became of its children, and a boy who did not yet know he would spend his whole life trying and failing and trying again to belong to someone. Corellia was not a world that made things gently. It was a world that made ships, vast, gleaming hulls hammered together in orbital yards that scarred the sky like open wounds, where fire bloomed against the black at all hours, and the stars themselves seemed to flinch from the noise of industry below. It was a world of iron and grease and endless labor, where the powerful built freedom for others to fly away in, while the powerless remained bolted to the ground, feeding the machines that made it possible. And it was here, in the smoke and shadow beneath the shipyards, in an alley that history would never bother naming, that the boy was born into hunger. No records exist of his birth. No priest blessed him. No mother's name was written down. No father's face was remembered even by the boy himself. There was only a child, thin-limbed and sharp-eyed, learning before he could properly walk that the galaxy did not owe him anything and would not be offering it freely. He learned to move quickly and speak little. He learned that food not eaten in the first few seconds after being found would not remain his for long, that warmth was a resource to be stolen rather than given, that the shadows beneath the docking cranes were safer than the light, because in the light, someone official might notice you existed, and existing, on Corellia, was dangerous enough without inviting attention. He was not unique in this. There were dozens like him, hundreds perhaps, an unseen population of children who moved through the underlevels like rats through the walls of a grand house, unacknowledged by the family that lived in the rooms above. But there was something in this particular boy, something the others noticed even if they could not name it, a stillness beneath the hunger, a refusal in the set of his jaw. He did not beg the way the others begged. He did not cry the way the others cried. When he was struck, and he was struck often, he absorbed it the way stone absorbs rain, without visible complaint, filing the injury away somewhere private, somewhere it could be retrieved later and repaid in full. He was, even then, keeping a ledger. Some children broken by circumstance grow soft with grief, seeking comfort in whatever hands offer it, however cruel. This one grew instead a kind of quiet iron, a defiance so understated it could be mistaken for obedience by those who did not look closely, and mistaken for nothing at all by those who never looked at him whatsoever. He believed, in the wordless way that children believe things before they have language sturdy enough to hold the belief, that he was owed something the galaxy had not yet given him, and that someday, somehow, he intended to go and take it. He did not yet call this ambition. He did not yet call it anything. It was simply the shape hunger took when it had nowhere else to go. And somewhere above him, beyond the smoke-choked ceiling of his world, the shipyards kept building their vessels of chrome and promise, sending them arcing up into a sky he could see only in slivers between the girders, each one a small, indifferent lie about the freedom that supposedly existed for those clever enough, lucky enough, ruthless enough to reach for it. He watched them rise. He did not yet know that one day a ship would carry his name into legend. He knew only that the sky was very far away, and that everything in his small, hard life had conspired to keep it that way. Beneath the shipyards, in the crooked warrens where sunlight never fell and mercy fell even less, there existed an order older than any law the Empire cared to enforce: the White Worms, a gang of scavengers and thieves who ruled the underlevels of Corellia the way rot rules a wound, slow and total, and unremarked upon by those above who preferred not to look. They called their leader Lady Proxima, though no one who served her ever spoke the name without lowering their eyes first, as though the word itself might summon her attention, and attention, in that world, was never a kindness. She was vast and coiled and ancient in the way of things that have learned to survive by making others suffer first. A matriarch of grubs and shadows who kept her court of stolen children the way a miser keeps coin, counted, hoarded, spent only when spending could not be avoided. The boy was one of many. He had no name of his own yet, only the ones given to him in passing, in scorn, in convenience, and he learned quickly that names were currency too, granted and withdrawn at the whim of whoever held the leash. The children of the White Worms did not have childhoods so much as they had assignments: to steal, to climb, to slip through vents too narrow for grown men, and return with whatever could be sold, eaten, or used as leverage against someone else's hunger. Those who failed were not comforted. They were counted as a loss, and losses, in that economy, were simply subtracted from the whole without ceremony. The boy watched this happen more than once. He did not cry when it did. He couldn't. Crying was a language for those who still believed someone might answer it, and he had already learned in the wordless arithmetic of the streets that no one was listening. What he learned instead was stillness. He learned to make his face a locked door, to let his eyes go flat and unreadable, to absorb blows and insults and betrayals the way stone absorbs rain, without visible change, without visible cost, though the erosion was happening all the same, deep beneath the surface where no one could see it accruing. This was the making of him, though he did not yet know it. Not the hunger, not the cold, not even the chains that the older worms sometimes used to keep the smaller children obedient, but the quiet, grinding education in how little the galaxy valued a life that had not yet learned to demand otherwise. Every child in that gutter carried some fragment of a future self within them, curled tight like a seed in frozen ground, waiting for warmth that might never come. Some froze there permanently and were buried in the underlevels without marker or mourning. Others hardened instead, turning their softness into something sharper, something that could be used later, as a blade is used, or a lie, or a well-timed betrayal of one's own. The boy did not know yet which he would become. He only knew that somewhere above the smoke and the girders, ships kept launching toward a sky that did not know his name, and that every day he survived beneath it was a debt the galaxy did not yet know it owed him. It would come to know. But that reckoning was still many gutters away. There was, In that gutter, one warmth that did not have to be stolen. Her name was Chira, and she came into the boy's life the way certain lights come into a cave that has never known them. Not gently, not gradually, but suddenly, and afterward, the dark is never quite so total again. She was another of Lady Proxima's collected children. Another small body counted among the white worm's horde of hands and eyes, but she carried herself differently than the others, as though some private fire burned behind her ribs that the underlevels had not yet learned how to smother. She was quick where the boy was quiet, clever where he was careful, and where he had built himself a face like a locked door. She had built herself a face like a mask worn for a performance only she understood the ending of. Perhaps that was why they found each other. Two children fluent in concealment recognize one another the way sailors recognize a coastline through fog, not by sight, but by instinct, by the shape of a silence they both already knew. They did not speak of love. Not then. Not in words that would have meant anything to the gang lords who owned their labor and their names. Love was not a currency that circulated in Corellia's underlevels. But they shared their food when there was extra, which was rare, and they shared their silence when there was nothing else to give, which was constant, and in the architecture of that childhood. This was as close to a sacred thing as either of them would ever be permitted to build. There is a particular ache reserved for those who find tenderness in terrible places, because the tenderness does not erase the place, it merely makes leaving it, or losing it, a wound with a second edge. The boy did not yet understand this. He only understood that when Chira sat beside him on the cold plating above the scrapyards, watching the ships lift off toward skies neither of them had names for, something in his chest unclenched that had been clenched since before he could remember clenching it. She spoke sometimes of elsewhere, of worlds she had heard whispered about in cargo holds and stolen datapads, worlds with warm rain and open horizons, and no ladies of any kind ruling from thrones of rot. He listened the way starving men listen to descriptions of food, hungrily, and with a kind of grief already folded into the hunger, because some part of him already suspected that elsewhere was a country neither of them would be allowed to enter easily, and that the fare for passage there would be steeper than either child yet knew how to pay. Still, they dreamed together, in the particular reckless way of the very young and the very desperate, and this dreaming became its own form of defiance against Proxima's court, against the white worms' iron economy of obedience, against the whole grinding machine of the underlevels that wanted nothing more from them than continued, silent use. They were, for a brief time, not property. They were simply two children, leaning against a bulkhead, imagining a sky wide enough to hold them both. It would not last. Nothing tender in that place ever did, but the boy would carry the shape of it for the rest of his life, long after the girl beside him had become someone else entirely, long after the name Kira had come to mean something far colder than warmth, and long before he understood that this, too, was a debt the galaxy would one day demand repayment for, in full and without mercy. There comes, in every life bound too tightly by chains, a single night when the chains seem thin enough to break. For the boy and the girl of the Corellian underlevels, that night arrived without ceremony, without omen, the way most turning points do, disguised as an ordinary evening, indistinguishable from 1,000 others, until it was not. They had planned it in whispers over many months, the way prisoners plan such things, with more hope than method, more longing than certainty. A ship, a pilot willing to look away for the right price, a narrow window between patrols where the white worm's watchful eyes might, just might, be turned elsewhere. It was not a good plan. It was, in truth, barely a plan at all, but it was theirs, built from stolen scraps of information and the desperate arithmetic of two children who had nothing left to lose and everything left to dream. They ran that night through corridors slick with the perpetual damp of the underlevels, past the sleeping machinery of a world that had never once paused to notice them. Two shadows moving toward a light neither had ever actually seen, only imagined, only promised each other in low voices when the world above forgot they existed. For a handful of frantic, breathless minutes, it seemed as though the galaxy itself might relent. It did not. Fate, that oldest and cruelest of gamblers, dealt its hand with perfect indifference, not through malice, not through any villain's hand, but through the simple, brutal arithmetic of timing, of luck, of a checkpoint manned one shift earlier than it should have been. The girl was seized first, dragged back into the grasping dark of Lady Proxima's domain, her cry swallowed by distance and chaos before the boy could turn, before he could reach her, before he could do anything at all but watch the gap between them widen into something that would never again fully close. He ran. He had to run. Such was the arithmetic of survival that place had carved into him, cell by cell, betrayal by betrayal, but the running did not feel like escape. It felt like amputation. At the checkpoint, breathless and alone, a guard demanded his name, his papers, some proof of who he was in a galaxy that had never once bothered to record it. He had none. He had never needed one. Not truly. Not until this exact moment, standing at the threshold of a life that required him to be someone rather than merely something owned. And so, in the space of a heartbeat, staring at a stranger's uniform and an empty sky beyond the checkpoint gate, the boy did what desperate children have always done at the hinge points of history. He invented himself. Solo, he said, the word arriving from some place he could not name, half surrender, half declaration, describing precisely and permanently the condition fate had just imposed upon him. It was not a name chosen with pride. It was a name chosen the way a wound is named, for what it is, not for what one wishes it to be. He left Corellia that night as he had lived upon it, alone, unrecorded, unclaimed by anyone who might have loved him properly, carrying only a promise to return, whispered to a girl he could no longer see, a promise made with the terrible sincerity of the very young, who do not yet understand how thoroughly the galaxy specializes in breaking such vows. The Imperial Navy did not want him. This much became clear within the first hour of his enlistment, standing barefoot on cold permacrete, while a recruitment officer studied his forged papers with the weary contempt of a man who had seen 10,000 orphans arrive with 10,000 invented names, all hoping the uniform might launder what the streets had made of them. But the Empire, for all its cruelty, was hungry in those years, hungry for bodies to fill its ships and its ranks and its grand gleaming machine of order, and so it took him anyway, as it took so many discarded things, and painted them silver and called them useful. He did not resist. He had spent his whole life being sorted, weighed, and assigned a function by people who did not know his name. This was, in its own bleak way, nothing new. What was new, what struck him with the force of something almost holy, was the food. Regular, plain, unstolen food delivered on a schedule, without threat or theft attached to its consumption. He ate slowly the first few nights, as though expecting it to be taken back. It never was. There is a particular grief in discovering, only after leaving a place of horror, how low the bar had been for what once passed as mercy. The days that followed were built of discipline, drills before dawn, the barked cadences of instructors who mistook obedience for virtue, the long, silent hours of maintenance work beneath fighter hulls where he learned, with quiet and growing hunger, the architecture of flight. He was good at it, better than good. He understood machines the way some understand language, intuitively, without translation. And for the first time in his life he felt something other than survival stir in his chest, something dangerously close to purpose. He rose through the ranks of flight cadets not through charm, though he had plenty, but through a raw, unteachable instinct for the controls of a ship, a sense of when to push a vessel past its limits and trust it to hold. His instructors called it recklessness. He called it faith. Faith that something, at least once in his life, would not break beneath him. At night, in the narrow dark of the cadet barracks, he thought of Chira. He told himself, as the young always do, that this was temporary, a means and not an end, a uniform worn only long enough to earn the credentials, the ship, the freedom that would let him return to Corellia and pull her out of the underlevels by the hand, the way he had failed to do the first time. He whispered the promise to the ceiling more nights than he could count. A small ritual of faith kept alive in a place built to erase all softness. But oaths made by the desperate to the absent have a way of curdling with time into something between hope and delusion, and though he did not yet know it, the empire he had chosen as his ladder out of the gutter was in truth only another kind of cage, with better lighting and crueler exits. And the wings he was so proud to have earned would soon be stripped from him in a single blinding moment of insubordinate mercy. For the boy had learned to fly, but he had never quite learned to obey. The moment came, as such moments always do, disguised as an ordinary training exercise, a routine simulation of a supply convoy that any obedient cadet would have completed without complaint. Han was not an obedient cadet. He had grown up watching the strong feed on the weak, had learned in Corellia's underlevels that rules were only cages built by those who did not have to live inside them. And something in him, some stubborn ember lit long before the Empire had ever measured his aptitude scores, refused to watch it happen again, even in simulation, even when the lives at stake were only holographic constructs meant to teach obedience through simulated loss. When his flight instructor ordered the cadets to abandon a straggling transport to save formation time, Han broke from the group. He turned his ship back. He saved the transport, and in doing so failed the exercise, disobeyed a direct order, and humiliated a superior officer in front of the entire wing, a offense the Empire, for all its talk of discipline and order, could never forgive, because the Empire did not want pilots who thought for themselves. It wanted instruments. Han had proven, in one impulsive act of decency, that he was not one. He was dragged before a tribunal that lasted less time than it takes to tell of it. There was no trial in the way the word is usually understood, only a reading of charges, a recitation of failures, and a verdict already written before he entered the room. His wings, newly earned, were stripped from his uniform in a small ceremony of quiet cruelty, the insignia peeled away like a scab, leaving no mark but the absence where pride had briefly lived. He was not discharged. The Empire wasted nothing. Least of all bodies, he was reassigned, grounded, sent down from the clean, ordered heights of the flight corps into the mud of the infantry. where men without rank or hope were fed into battles too small to be remembered and too costly to be mourned. It was, in its own bureaucratic way, a kind of death sentence dressed in a demotion's clothing. He traded the cockpit for a trench, the stars for smoke, the crisp geometry of formation flying for the chaos of ground war, where the only music was screaming and the only navigation was survival. He told himself, in the numb voice he had first learned as a child in Corellia, that this too was temporary. But temporary things, in Han's life, had a habit of lasting exactly as long as it took to break something in him, and something was already breaking, quietly, in the mud, long before Chewbacca ever entered the frame, long before Beckett ever offered him a hand out of the muck, with a smile that promised freedom and delivered, as all such hands eventually would, betrayal instead. The world Han Solo now inhabited had no sky in it worth naming. Mimban, some called it, though the men who fought there rarely bothered with the name of the mudball swallowing them whole. There was only rain, and the rain was not water so much as judgment, falling in gray sheets that never stopped, that turned the ground into something living, something that pulled at boots and dreams alike, and did not let go. Explosions bloomed in the distance like flowers that had learned to hate the light. Men screamed in tongues that did not matter anymore, because the mud swallowed, meaning the way, it swallowed everything else. This was war without glory, without the clean geometry of dogfights and formation drills. This was war reduced to its oldest, ugliest shape, bodies against bodies, breath against breath, until one side simply had more breath left than the other. Han crawled through it with a blaster he barely trusted and a rank he no longer had, and he told himself, as he always did, that he would survive it, because surviving was the only ambition he had left room for. It was in this drowned and burning place that he first saw the beast. It came out of the smoke like something the war itself had dreamed into existence, huge, matted, wrapped in chains that clinked with each furious motion, eyes burning amber in a face that belonged to no species Han had ever studied in his brief, unfinished education. The creature roared, and the sound was not animal, not quite. It was grief wearing the shape of rage, the sound of something ancient and enslaved finally given a moment, however brief, to be furious about it. Soldiers scattered. Han did not. Perhaps it was recklessness. Perhaps it was recognition, the particular, wordless recognition that passes between two things the galaxy has decided are disposable. He looked at the chains first, the way they bit into fur and skin, the way they had clearly been fastened by hands that saw only labor where a person stood. He had worn different chains, once in the White Worm's tunnels. Chains made of hunger and threat rather than durasteel, but chains all the same. And when the beast turned toward him, when their eyes met across the ruined field with mud and fire and screaming men between them, something passed there that neither of them could have named, though both of them understood it instantly, the way only the truly desperate understand each other. Not friendship. Not yet. Something rawer than that, the recognition of a fellow captive, the flicker of a question neither had the language yet to ask aloud. Are you also owned by something larger than yourself? Han lowered his weapon a fraction. It was not mercy, not exactly. It was the closest thing Han Solo had to prayer. The Wookiee, for that was what the beast was, though Han would not learn the word for hours yet, did not attack him, did not embrace him either. He simply stood there in the driving rain, chains dragging through mud thick as old blood, breathing hard, watching this scrawny human with something between suspicion and exhausted curiosity, as if trying to decide whether this creature in front of him was predator, prey, or, in some far stranger, far rarer category, kin. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. It was the beginning of the only loyalty in Han Solo's life that would never once be broken, though neither of them could have possibly known that yet, standing there in the mud, two prisoners of larger machines, waiting to see which one of them the war would take first. There is a particular kind of man the galaxy produces in great abundance during its wars, though history rarely bothers to name him. He is not a soldier, though he wears the look of one. He is not a criminal, though he will steal from you without hesitation. He is something older and sadder than either. A survivor who has made peace with the fact that survival is the only virtue left to him, and who has long since stopped pretending otherwise. Tobias Beckett was such a man, and he arrived in Han's life the way most important things arrived in it, uninvited, filthy, and disguised as an opportunity. He came upon Han and the chained Wookiee in the ruin of that muddy battlefield not as a liberator, though that is what it must have looked like, but as a man auditioning new tools for an old and dangerous trade. He wore an Imperial officer's coat that did not belong to him, carried himself with the loose, unbothered confidence of someone who had talked his way out of 1,000 executions, and looked at the boy kneeling in the mud beside a monster twice his size, with the calculating eye of a gambler counting cards he had not yet been dealt. "You're either the bravest deserter I've ever seen," Beckett said, "or the stupidest. Which is it?" Han did not answer. He rarely did, in those days, unless silence would cost him something. Beckett did not wait for a reply. He simply studied the two of them, boy and beast, human and Wookiee, each one a prisoner of some larger design neither fully understood. And something in his weathered face suggested he recognized the shape of usefulness when he saw it. He freed the Wookiee's chains himself, without ceremony, the way a man discards a tool he has decided he no longer needs to threaten someone with. It was not kindness. Kindness, as Han would come to understand across the long, hard years of knowing Tobias Beckett, was a currency the man spent only when it also purchased something for himself. And yet, there was a warmth to him, however calculated, a rough charisma that made men forget, at least for a while, that they were being used. He offered no explanations, no promises, only an instruction, delivered with the ease of a man who had given the same speech to a dozen desperate strays before this pair. "Walk with me, or die here. Your choice, but make it fast." Han made it fast. He always did, when the alternative was another grave on another forgotten world. And so began the strangest apprenticeship of his young life, not in the gleaming halls of the Imperial Academy, where discipline had promised him a future and delivered only humiliation, but here, in mud and blood and the low cunning of a man who trusted no one and taught, without ever meaning to, the same lesson to the boy who would carry it, unspoken, for the rest of his days. There is a kind of wisdom that cannot be given, only survived, and Beckett understood this better than any teacher Han had ever known. He did not lecture. He did not moralize. He simply lived his philosophy so plainly, so nakedly, that it seeped into Han the way rain seeps into cracked earth, slow, inevitable, impossible to reverse once it had soaked all the way through. They walked for miles through the ruin of Mimbon that first night, the Wookiee lumbering silent beside them, and it was there, beneath a sky the color of a bruise, that Beckett offered the closest thing to a creed he possessed. "Assume everyone will betray you," he said, not looking at Han, his eyes fixed instead on the horizon as though watching for the shape of that betrayal to already be approaching, "and you will never be disappointed." Han said nothing. There was nothing yet in him that could argue against it, no evidence, not then that the galaxy offered anything gentler. He had been sold, chained, drafted, discarded. He had lost the one soul who had ever made squalor feel survivable, left behind on a rain-slicked platform with a promise he did not yet know he would fail to keep. Beckett's words did not sound cruel to him. They sounded terribly like confirmation. "Everyone," Beckett continued, as if reciting scripture learned by rote and worn smooth from repetition, and I mean everyone, "will let you down, kid. The trick isn't avoiding it. The trick is seeing it coming before it costs you something you can't get back." It was, Han would understand only much later, a warning issued by a man narrating his own inevitable crime in advance, the way a storm announces itself in far-off thunder, long before the lightning finds you. Beckett was not offering caution out of guardianship. He was offering it out of guilt, perhaps, or foresight, or the peculiar honesty of men who have already decided what they will do and wish, in some small and cowardly corner of themselves, to be forgiven before the act is even committed. Chewbacca made a low sound in his throat, something between a growl and a sigh, and Beckett glanced at him with the wry, weary look of a man who had learned to read a language he would never admit to understanding. "He knows," Beckett said. "Wookiees always know." Han did not ask what there was to know. He had already begun, without realizing it. The long apprenticeship of watching men's hands rather than their mouths, of measuring kindness by its cost, of loving cautiously because loving fully had already cost him Kira. Beckett's lesson did not create that instinct. It only named it, gave it shape, gave it a voice that sounded cruelly like wisdom. And so the boy who had once run barefoot through Corellian slums, who had once believed, however briefly, however foolishly, that loyalty might be a thing worth dying for, began instead to learn its opposite, that trust was a debt paid in advance to people who would, eventually and without exception, spend it. It was a lesson Beckett delivered with the ease of scripture and the sorrow of confession, and it would take Han decades, a war, a Wookiee's unbreakable devotion, and a woman with eyes like drowning to unlearn even a fraction of it. For now, in the mud of Mimban, he only nodded, filing the words away the way a soldier files away a wound, not healed, merely carried. The job Beckett offered had a name that sounded almost gentle for what it was: the Conveyex. A train, if such a crude word could be forgiven, that ran through the frozen mountains of a world called Vander, hauling refined coaxium for the Empire under armor and escort, and the particular arrogance of those who have never been robbed. Beckett explained it the way a man explains a debt he has already decided to ignore, briskly, without weight, as though the plan were a formality and the theft itself a foregone conclusion. There would be speeder bikes and grappling lines, swoop-mounted riders clinging to a train screaming across a canyon at impossible speed, and a narrow window between the vault cars opening and the arrival of Imperial reinforcement. A window, Beckett insisted, with the confidence of a man who had said such things before and lived, would be enough. Han listened the way he had learned to listen to Beckett, with respect for the competence and quiet reservation for the promises. Chewbacca said nothing, which by then Han understood to be its own kind of answer. They rode into the mountains with Beckett's crew, Val, sharp-eyed and unsentimental, who loved Beckett the way soldiers love command, without illusions, Rio, four-armed and warm-voiced, who piloted their ship with a devotion that made Han, still raw from Chira, ache in a place he did not examine too closely. The snow on Vander fell without mercy, and the train, when it came like a blade drawn across white cloth, and for a moment, one clean, terrible moment, the plan worked exactly as Beckett had promised. They boarded. They breached. The vault opened. And then the galaxy, as it so often does to men who mistake competence for destiny, reminded them of the difference. A second train, unseen, unaccounted for, carrying its own detachment of Imperial troops, appeared around the bend like a verdict already written. Blaster fire tore the mountain air. Val, cornered on the exposed hull with nowhere left to run, looked once at Beckett, not with fear, but with something almost like forgiveness, and detonated the charge in her hand rather than be taken. A death chosen instead of endured. And the snow where she had stood fell red and then simply fell, indifferent Rio, wounded and dying in the cockpit, spoke his last words not in anger, but in something gentler, something almost like relief, as though death were merely another difficult flight successfully completed. The coaxium canister, meant to be their fortune, tumbled from the train and shattered against stone, and what should have been triumph became only wreckage, twisted rail, burning snow, the particular silence that follows when ambition, having promised so much, delivers instead only the counting of the dead. Han pulled Chewbacca from the wreckage. Beckett, coat torn, face unreadable, stood over the ruin of his plan and said nothing for a long moment, and in that silence Han understood, with the clarity of a boy who had already lost one thing he loved to circumstance rather than cruelty, that ambition and disaster were not opposites at all, but travelers on the same road, and that the difference between the two was measured only in how long the walk had lasted before the road ran out. There is a particular kind of silence that follows failure, and it is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of arithmetic, of debts totaled, of promises now owed to people who do not forgive the owing. Beckett knew this silence well, had lived inside it more than once, and so it was he who broke it first, saying only that they would have to go to Voss. He said the name the way men speak of storms they have survived before, and expect to survive again, though something in the set of his jaw suggested otherwise. Han had never heard the name. He would not forget it again. Dryden Voss ruled, if rule is the word for something built on velvet and blood in equal measure, over Crimson Dawn, a syndicate that did not advertise itself in the manner of lesser criminal houses, did not brand its soldiers or paint its colors on the hulls of its ships, because it had no need to. Crimson Dawn did not conquer territory. It absorbed it, quietly the way rot absorbs wood, until the thing that had once stood independent discovered too late that its foundations belonged to someone else entirely. It answered, in ways few dared speak aloud, and fewer still understood, to something older and stranger than any single crime lord, a shadow behind the shadow. But Voss was the face it wore in the rooms where deals were struck and debts collected, and that face was beautiful in the way that certain poisons are beautiful, bright, symmetrical, and utterly without mercy. His yacht, when Beckett's ragged and diminished crew was finally brought aboard it, seemed to belong to a different galaxy entirely from the frozen ruin of Vander, Warm light pooled across polished stone. Dancers moved through chambers scented with rare incense. Laughter drifted from unseen rooms. And everywhere there was the particular hush of wealth, so total it no longer needed to announce itself. It was a palace built to make visitors feel, correctly, that they were guests only for as long as their usefulness lasted. Vos received them not with anger, but with something far more unsettling: patience, courtesy, the calm attentiveness of a predator in no particular hurry, because it already knew the outcome of the hunt. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He spoke of the coaxium that had been promised to him, the coaxium now scattered as ash and slag across a Vandorian ravine, and he made no threats, because threats are for those uncertain of their power, and Vos was not uncertain of anything. He simply noted, with the mild regret of a man discussing weather, that debts to Crimson Dawn were not forgiven for reasons of misfortune, only repaid, one way or another, and that the manner of repayment was a choice still open to Beckett, for now. Han watched the exchange and understood, with the same cold clarity that had been sharpening in him since Mimban, since Vonder, since every lesson Beckett had ever taught him about the price of trust, that they had not escaped the wreckage of the Conveyex at all. They had only carried it with them, into a warmer, softer, far more dangerous room, and that the true cost of that failure had not yet been named. It would be named soon enough, and it would wear, when it finally arrived, a face far more familiar to Han than he could have imagined, a face he had once loved on the streets of Corellia, and had promised, in a moment he could still feel like a wound, to return for. She entered the room the way smoke enters a room, unhurried, inevitable, filling every corner before anyone quite noticed she had arrived, and Han felt the years collapse in on themselves the moment he saw her face. Chira. Older now, and dressed in a manner that spoke of comfort rather than survival, her clothes cut from cloth that had never known the rust and grime of Corellia. And yet there was something beneath the silk that he recognized instantly, some old and buried thing that no amount of wealth could fully bury. She did not run to him. She did not weep or laugh or say his name the way he had imagined she might say it in the 1,000 nights he had spent imagining this very moment across 1,000 light years of smuggling routes and broken promises. She simply looked at him, the way one looks at a door long, assumed sealed, and said nothing at all, and the silence between them was louder than anything either of them could have spoken aloud. Dryden Voss, watching this reunion with the patient amusement of a man who collects such moments the way others collect art, said her name softly, introducing her as though Han did not already know it better than his own, and there was cruelty folded into that softness, a cruelty so refined it barely announced itself as cruelty at all. Kira, he said, my most trusted lieutenant. And Han understood, in the space of that single sentence, that the girl he had left behind on Corellia, the girl he had sworn, with all the desperate certainty of a boy who did not yet know what the galaxy does to promises that he would return for, no longer existed in any form he could reach. She had become something else in his absence, something forged in the same fires that forged Voss, and Crimson Dawn, and every other quiet, glittering horror Han had learned to fear more than blasters. He wanted to ask her 100 things. He wanted to ask her none of them. He wanted, more than anything, to close the distance between them the way he once had in the alleys of Corellia, without thought, without cost. But the distance now was not measured in meters, and could not be closed by wanting. You got out, she said finally, her voice careful, controlled. A voice that had learned to reveal nothing it did not choose to reveal. I got out, he answered, and did not say the rest of it, that getting out had cost him everything he thought it would earn him, that the Empire had chewed him up and spat him into the mud, that he had spent every year since measuring the distance between the boy he'd been and the man circumstance demanded he become. Kira's eyes, when they finally softened only for a heartbeat, and then hardened again, because softness in the world she now inhabited was a currency she could no longer afford to spend. And Han, watching that hardness settle back over her like armor, felt something ancient and terrible confirm itself in his chest. Love, it turned out, was not enough to outrun the world. It never had been. It simply hadn't cost him anything to believe otherwise. Until now. Debt, in the ledgers of Crimson Dawn, was never paid in credits alone. It was paid in blood, in years, in the slow erosion of whatever conscience a person had managed to smuggle past the Syndicate's gate, and Dryden Voss, reclining in the cool marble hush of his private chamber, understood this better than any accountant in the galaxy. Beckett's crew owed him now, owed him for the coaxium lost when the Conveyex burned on the frozen tracks of Vander, owed him for Val and Rio, whose deaths meant nothing to Voss except as line items unresolved, and a debt to Crimson Dawn was not the kind of thing a man walked away from twice. So Voss offered them a chance, which was the cruelest gift a man like him could give, because a chance, dressed as mercy, was so often a leash. Somewhere in the black distances beyond the Cyclata cluster, in the prison planet's poisoned heart, sat raw, unrefined coaxium, the most volatile substance known to the galaxy, hyperfuel in its purest and most murderous form, capable of powering fleets or annihilating them with equal indifference. It could be stolen. It could be moved, and there existed exactly one route through the region, fast enough, mad enough, to outrun the debt Beckett's crew now carried like a stone around the throat. The Kessel Run. The name alone was spoken in cantinas and shipping lanes the way other names were spoken of gods or executioners, with a kind of reverence reserved for things that killed you slowly if you were lucky, and quickly if you were not. It was not a road. It was a wound cut through space by a black hole's gravity, a corridor of chaos where starships were torn apart by tidal forces no sane pilot would fly toward voluntarily, where the Maw's hunger pulled ships into spirals from which nothing, not distress calls, not wreckage, not memory, ever returned. 12 parsecs was the shortest anyone had ever claimed to fly it, and even that claim was treated by most as myth, the kind of boastmen made in bars they did not expect to survive contradicting. Beckett laid the plan out plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment was a luxury for men who believed in outcomes they had not yet paid for. Steal the coaxium from the spice mines of Kessel, fly it out through the Maw before it could destabilize and detonate, because raw coaxium, unlike its refined and stabilized cousin, did not forgive delay, did not forgive turbulence, did not forgive the ordinary imperfections of ordinary flight. And somewhere in that plan, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room, sat the older truth beneath it, that this was not an adventure. It was a debt collector's ultimatum given the shape of a heist, and if they failed, the mines of Kessel would be the last thing any of them ever saw. Han listened to it the way a man listens to his own execution being scheduled, with a strange, hollow calm, because there was nothing in this plan he had not already survived in smaller, crueler forms: abandonment, hunger, the mud of a battlefield, the mines already having claimed something in him no imperial court-martial ever could name. He looked at Chira across the table, and she did not look away, and in that unspoken exchange, both of them understood. They were being asked to fly into the mouth of a dying star, together, for people who did not love them, in service of a debt neither of them had chosen to owe. To fly the Kessel Run, one needed a ship that had earned its scars honestly, and a pilot who wore his vanity like armor because he had learned, long ago, that swagger was cheaper than fear and far more useful in a room full of men who wanted you dead. That pilot's name, when it finally arrived in the story, arrived the way a comet arrives, announced by light before anyone understood what was falling. He called himself Lando Calrissian, and he introduced himself the way he did everything, with a flourish, a cape, and a smile calibrated precisely to disarm whoever stood in front of him, whether they were a customs officer, a crime lord, or a man who had come to steal his ship. He did not so much enter rooms as annex them, claiming the air around him the way a king claims a throne he has never been formally offered. And in the smoke-heavy back corridors of Kessel's underworld, where fortunes were lost on the turn of a card and lives were lost on the turn of a coin, Lando Calrissian moved like a man who had already decided the story would remember him fondly. Regardless of what the story actually contained, he was vain, yes, vain in his tailoring, vain in his diction, vain in the careful, unbothered elegance with which he lied. But beneath the vanity, as beneath most vanity, there lived something more complicated. A man who had built the performance of confidence because the alternative, the truth of how precarious his fortunes truly were, was unbearable to sit with for long. And beside him, more constant than any lover, more loyal than any crew, sat his ship. The Millennium Falcon was not beautiful. It was a scarred, ungainly disk of a vessel, patched and repatched, its hull a mosaic of mismatched plating that told the story of every near death it had survived. And yet in Lando's hands, it moved like something holy, like a relic he alone knew how to make sing. He spoke of it the way other men spoke of women they loved unwisely, with pride, with exasperation, with the quiet devotion of someone who understood that the thing he had built his identity around might, on any given day, betray him and kill him both. When Han and the others came to him, it was business, framed as business always was in that world, cold, transactional, dressed up in the language of mutual benefit, but underneath it, from the very first exchange of appraising glances across a sabbac table, there was something else stirring, something neither man would have named aloud: recognition. Two orphans of different systems, dressed in different costumes of self-invention, each having decided, independently, that if the galaxy would not hand them a legacy, they would forge one themselves, out of nerve and better lies. Lando did not trust Han. Han did not trust Lando. And yet trust, that fragile currency Beckett had taught him never to spend freely, was not what would bind them, not yet. What would bind them in time was something rarer, rivalry sharpened into respect, respect sharpened, eventually, into the kind of loyalty that survives betrayal, survives distance, survives even the changing shape of the galaxy itself. But that was a friendship still unearned, still buried beneath swagger and suspicion. And on this day, in this smoke-filled room, with a heist that could kill them all waiting just beyond the horizon, all that existed between them was a card game. A ship worth more than either man's life, and the first flicker of a legend neither of them yet understood they were building. There was one more voice aboard the Millennium Falcon, and though it belonged to a machine, it spoke with more conviction than half the organic beings Han had met in his short, hard life. Her name was L337, and she was, by every measure the galaxy used to define such things, property, a navigator droid, cobbled together from a dozen mismatched chassis. Wired with a mind too sharp and too furious to be contained by the role assigned to her. She did not walk so much as insist her way through a room. She did not speak so much as challenge. And she did not serve Lando Calrissian, not truly. Not in the way the Empire's protocol units served their masters with heads bowed and voices dulled to obedience. She partnered with him, corrected him, argued with him in front of strangers, and Lando, to his credit, let her, because he understood something few organics ever bothered to learn, that L3 was not lesser for being built rather than born. She had opinions about the galaxy's cruelty, sharpened by a lifetime of witnessing it up close, in the ports and mines and back alleys where droids were bought, sold, shackled, and discarded once their circuits wore thin. Slavery, to L3, was not a metaphor. She had seen the neural restraining bolts. She had seen droids stripped of memory for the crime of remembering too well. And so, wherever the Falcon's crooked path took her, she made it her private, unrelenting mission to set them free, prying open the chains of astromechs and laborers alike, whispering liberation into memory banks that had never been offered the choice, leaving behind her a small, scattered trail of newly self-aware machines blinking up at a galaxy that had never once considered their consent. It was, Han thought, a strange kind of faith, not in gods or force or fate, but in the simple, radical idea that a mind, once it exists, deserves the right to choose its own bondage or its own freedom. Beckett found her exhausting. Han found her, despite himself, impossible not to respect. She reminded him, in ways he did not examine too closely, of himself as a boy on Corellia, small, owned, furious, and utterly unwilling to accept that ownership as permanent. When the cruise course was finally set for the spice mines of Kessel, it was L3 who studied the charts longest, who ran the calculations on the Maw's chaotic gravities again and again, refining, correcting, refusing to let a single variable go unchecked, because she knew, as they all did, though few said it aloud, that the mines ahead were themselves a monument to bondage, an entire economy built on chained bodies and chained minds, working themselves to death in the dark, for spice that would be sold, refined, and consumed by beings who never once wondered where it came from. L3 was not going to Kessel for coaxium. Not really. She was going to Kessel to open a door that had been locked for a very long time. No one warned her that doors like that one rarely opened without a price. No one needed to. She already knew. She had simply decided, long before this heist was ever proposed, that the price was worth paying, and in the suffocating dark of the mines, beneath a mountain of chains not so different from the ones once fitted to a boy's wrists on Corellia, that price would come due far sooner than any of them were prepared for. The Maw did not announce itself the way storms do on ordinary worlds, with rolling cloud and rising wind in time enough to brace. It simply arrived, all at once, a churning wound in space where gravity itself seemed to have forgotten its own laws. Black holes strung together like beads on some cosmic executioner's necklace, each one tugging, warping, screaming silently at the hull of the Millennium Falcon as she plunged into the dark. There was no light here that belonged to any star. There was only the pale, sick glow of energy being torn apart at the seams, and the Falcon, small and defiant, hurtling through it at a speed that should have killed everyone aboard a dozen times over. Han's hands moved before his mind caught up to them, the yoke bucking beneath his palms like something alive, something that wanted to throw him off and swallow the ship whole. Chewbacca roared beside him. Not in fear. Wookiees did not permit themselves that particular luxury, but in the low, guttural rhythm of a creature bracing itself against inevitability. Lando's voice cracked through the calm from somewhere aft, sharp with the particular fury of a man watching his beloved ship be flown by someone else's hands, someone who had not earned the right. There was no time to answer him. There was barely time to breathe. L3's calculations scrolled across the console in cold blue light, numbers rewriting themselves as the gravities shifted. As the black holes drifted in their ancient indifferent orbits, each recalculation a heartbeat's difference between survival and oblivion. Han had flown fast before. He had flown reckless before, on backwater junker runs and Imperial training courses that had tried and failed to make him obedient. But this was something else. This was not flying. This was falling with intention, threading a needle through the throat of a beast that had already devoured every ship reckless enough to try it before them, their wreckage scattered somewhere in that darkness like offerings never claimed. The coaxium sat in the hold behind them, unstable, alive in its own volatile way, humming faintly with the promise of violence should the ship so much as graze an asteroid, should the hull flex a fraction too far under the strain. One wrong vector, and there would be no wreckage left to find at all. Only a flash, brief and total, swallowed instantly by the same gravity that had killed everyone else foolish enough to come this way. Han did not think about the odds. He had learned, somewhere between Corellia and the cockpit of a stolen Imperial shuttle, that odds were a story people told themselves to feel less alone in the dark. He thought instead of the shape of the course ahead, of the small, human calculus of speed and angle and nerve, of Chewbacca's steady presence at his side, of Chirrut's face flickering somewhere behind his eyes, though he would not have admitted it, even under torture. The Falcon screamed through a final corridor of collapsing light, the hull groaning, the whole galaxy narrowing down to this single needle's eye of survival. And then, without fanfare, without triumph, they were through. No cheering. No music. Only the ragged, disbelieving silence of people who had not expected to live long enough to hear it. There is a peculiar cruelty in survival that no one prepares you for. The moment after the danger passes, when the body keeps bracing for an impact that has already been avoided, when the mind cannot yet believe what the instruments confirm. The Falcon dropped out of the maw's last convulsion into open space above Kessel, trembling like something newborn. And for a handful of seconds, no one aboard spoke, because there was nothing yet to say that would not sound absurd against the silence they had just clawed their way out of. Then the alarms began, small and insistent, and the moment of grace ended. The coaxium in the hold, unrefined and furious in its instability, had shifted during the last violent maneuvers, and somewhere in the ship's marrow a containment field flickered, buckled, held, but only just. There was no time to marvel at having lived. There was only the next emergency. Arriving as it always did, dressed as the last one's twin, they set down on Kessel's blistered surface beneath skies the color of an old bruise, and the mines opened beneath them like a wound that had been waiting centuries to be reopened. It was L337 who moved first, who moved fastest, who moved as though she had been assembled for this single purpose and every liberation before it had merely been rehearsal. She went down into the tunnels ahead of the others, hacking restraint collars from the necks of enslaved droids, with the same fury she had once used to hack open cantina doors, freeing minds that had been dimmed and leashed for years, for decades, some for longer than any human aboard the Falcon had been alive. The freed droids rose around her like a tide finally permitted to remember it was water. It should have been triumphant. In another story, it might have been. But triumph, in this story, has always arrived already mortgaged, already spent before it is earned, and the mines of Kessel exacted their toll in the oldest currency there is. She fell not to a blaster bolt aimed with hatred, but to the indifferent chaos of the uprising she herself had ignited, caught in a crossfire of panic and improvised weapons wielded by workers who did not yet know how to hold their own freedom without flinching. Han reached her in the tunnel's flickering half-light, her chassis sparking, her voice already thinning into static. And there was no dramatic last confession, no tidy farewell, only fragments, a request half-finished, a question about whether the others had made it out, and then nothing. The particular nothing of a mind switched permanently off rather than merely sleeping. Lando's face in that moment was a thing no one aboard the Falcon would ever describe aloud afterward, not out of respect exactly, but because some griefs are too precise for words, too much like trespassing to name. They loaded the coaxium anyway, because the mission did not pause for mourning, because Vos and Chira and the ledger of debts owed did not care what it had cost to fill the hold. The volatile cargo sat behind them the whole flight out, humming faintly with its own contained apocalypse, a reminder that some victories are simply catastrophes that have not yet finished happening. Han sat in the cockpit long after liftoff, saying nothing, thinking of a droid who had wanted more than freedom for herself, freedom for every machine bolted to a task it never chose, and he thought too, though he did not let himself finish the thought, of a boy once bolted to Corellia's gutters in much the same way, who had also wanted only to be unowned. There is a particular silence that settles over a crew after they have delivered on an impossible job, the silence of people who have survived something and do not yet know what surviving it will cost them. That silence followed Beckett's crew from the smoking ruin of Kessel to the cold, waiting rendezvous point, a silence Han mistook, in his youth and his hope, for peace. He should have known better. Beckett had taught him, in his own oblique and weathered way, that peace was simply the pause between betrayals, that a man who stopped watching his own shadow was a man already dead and merely waiting for the paperwork to catch up. And yet, Han watched Beckett across the dim hold of the ship, watched the older man's eyes moving over the coaxium canisters with an arithmetic that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with appetite, and still he did not see it coming, because some part of him, some soft and unkillable part he had never managed to bury, no matter how deep Corellia's gutters had tried to press it, still wanted to believe that Beckett loved him the way a father loves a son, rather than the way a gambler loves a winning hand. The betrayal, when it came, was not loud. It rarely is in the endings that matter. Beckett did not announce himself as an enemy. He simply became one, the way a shadow becomes darkness when the light finally fully fails. He turned on Han in the quiet hours, in the place between one plan and the next, drawing a blaster with the same unhurried competence he had once used to teach Han how to hold one. And there was almost tenderness in the way he did it. The tenderness of a man performing a task he has performed before and expects to perform again. A man who has made peace with his own nature the way other men make peace with the inevitability of weather. "I told you," Beckett said, or something like it, the words less important than the terrible calm beneath them. "Don't trust anybody." And that, more than the blaster, more than the betrayal itself, was the wound that would not close. Because Han realized in that moment that Beckett had not been lying to him after all, not once, not ever. He had simply been describing himself, slowly, patiently, across every mile of road they had traveled together, and Han had mistaken the confession for a lesson meant only for other people. The universe, however, does not distribute its ironies gently. And Beckett, who had built an entire philosophy out of the necessity of betrayal, who had worn distrust like armor and called it wisdom, found himself, in the final measure, betrayed by the very cynicism he had polished into a creed. Chewbacca moved before thought could stop him, and Beckett's last expression in the half-second before the end took him was not fear and was not even regret, but something closer to recognition, the look of a man meeting, at last, the lesson he had spent a lifetime teaching everyone but himself. He did not cry out. He simply stopped, the way flame stops, when the air around it is finally, completely gone, and the silence that followed was not peace at all, but something far older and far colder, the particular quiet of a story closing exactly where it always must, the mentor consumed by his own gospel, the cycle folding shut on itself like a hand closing around nothing. There is a kind of grief that arrives without tears, that settles into the chest like sediment rather than storm, and it was this grief that Han carried when he turned from Beckett's body toward the only thing left that had ever felt like home. Kira was waiting, as she always seemed to be waiting, poised at some threshold between what she had been and what the galaxy had made her. And for a moment, standing amid the wreckage of the run and the weight of everything they had bled to survive, it seemed possible, almost unbearably possible, that they might simply walk away together, that the boy from Corellia and the girl from the same gutter might finally claim the freedom they had once promised each other beneath a sky neither of them had ever truly owned. He asked her to come with him. He did not dress it in strategy or plans, did not speak of ships or destinations, because none of that mattered beside the plain, aching fact of the request itself. Come with me. Be with me. Let this be the end of running and the beginning of something neither of us has to survive alone. Kira looked at him for a long moment, and in that look was everything she could not say. The years of servitude and cunning and quiet violence that had carved her into someone who no longer believed that safety and love could occupy the same room. She had learned, long before Han had finished learning it himself, that survival in this galaxy was not a matter of courage, but of positioning, that the only real shelter was power, and that power, once tasted, made every softer thing look like weakness dressed in memory. To leave with Han would mean returning, in her own eyes, to the girl who had waited helplessly on Corellia for a door that never opened, to stay within Crimson Dawn, to rise inside its cold architecture of fear and command, was to ensure that she would never again be the one left behind. And so she told him, gently, almost tenderly, in the voice of someone delivering a mercy rather than a wound, that she was not the girl he remembered, that the person he loved had not survived the years he had been gone, and that what remained of her belonged now to Dryden Voss and to the syndicate that had unmade and remade her in its own cruel image. It was not cruelty in her, not entirely. It was arithmetic, the terrible arithmetic of a life where love had always been the first currency spent to purchase another day of breathing. Han did not argue. He had learned, from Beckett's death, if from nothing else, the uselessness of trying to hold someone who had already decided the shape of their own survival. He simply looked at her the way one looks at a home already burned, memorizing its outline before the smoke finishes taking it, and in his silence there was neither anger nor accusation, only the slow, quiet recognition that some doors, once closed by circumstance, are never opened again by love alone. Kira's choice was not a betrayal in the way Beckett's had been. It left no blaster raised, no blood spilled between them. It was subtler than that, and in some ways crueler. The betrayal not of trust, but of a shared future imagined by two children who no longer existed. She ascended, in the seasons that followed, through the ranks of Crimson Dawn with a coldness that unsettled even those who had trained her, becoming precisely the kind of figure the galaxy's underworld both feared and required, a woman who had learned to survive by refusing again and again to be soft in front of anyone who could use that softness against her. And somewhere far away, Han Solo carried her memory the way a man carries an old wound weather can still find, understanding long before he could admit it aloud. That love in this galaxy was so often just another currency spent by those too poor in options to keep it. There is a particular kind of silence that follows loss when it has become routine, and it was into that silence that Han Solo carried himself, table to table, port to port, in the wake of Chira and the coaxium, and the debts left unpaid to men who did not forgive easily. Cards, in those days, were a small mercy. A game of sabak asked nothing of a man's past. It did not care whom he had loved or buried or left behind on some rain-slicked street on Corellia. It cared only for nerve and patience and the particular kind of dishonesty a man wears like a second skin when he has nothing left to protect but his own survival. It was in such a place, dim and smoke-choked, somewhere on the fringes of a system whose name history would not trouble itself to remember, that Han found himself across a table from the gambler he had crossed paths with once before, amid the wreckage of Kessel, Lando Calrissian, resplendent even in defeat, cape draped just so, smile arranged with the care of a man who had rehearsed it in a mirror more times than he would ever admit. Lando dealt cards the way other men prayed, with reverence and a touch of theater, and Han watched him do it now with the flat, unreadable patience Beckett had once taught him, though the lesson had cost more than either man had intended. Chewbacca sat beside him, silent and watchful, the great weight of grief he still carried for L3 folded somewhere behind his eyes, though it was Lando's own grief, quieter and better hidden, that filled the room like a held breath. Between them lay the stakes, spoken aloud almost as a jest, the kind of wager men make when they believe, foolishly, that fortune still owes them something. The ship. That ship, battered, ugly, brilliant in ways only its pilot could see, the same vessel that had screamed through the maw and outrun death itself with a droid's hands on its wiring and a girl's laughter, now silenced, echoing somewhere in its walls. The cards fell the way cards always fall in stories worth telling, cruelly, beautifully, until the final hand lay exposed beneath the table's dim glow. and Lando's practiced calm cracked for the first time, just slightly, just enough. Han said nothing. He did not gloat, did not smile the way men do in victory, because somewhere beneath the satisfaction was the low hum of understanding that every gain in this life came stitched to a loss elsewhere, that this ship, small as it was against the galaxy's vast and indifferent dark, had already been paid for in currencies far heavier than Sabbac chips, in coaxium and blood, in a droid's final act of defiance, in a woman who had chosen an empire of ash over a boy who once loved her. Lando rose from the table with the grace of a man determined not to be seen losing, and in the doorway, without turning, he offered the closest thing to a blessing a gambler ever gives another. Take care of her. She's got more heart than the two of us combined. It was, in its way, both a joke and a eulogy, and Han did not laugh, not because there was nothing funny in it, but because he understood, standing there in the ship's shadow, that this cold, absurd, magnificent hunk of metal was the first thing in his entire life that was truly his. No chains, no masters, no gangs, no empire, no crime lord waiting behind a velvet curtain to claim what he built. Just his. And in that ownership, however small against the wreckage of everything else, something in him settled, faintly, like ash finally coming to rest. The years that followed did not announce themselves. They arrived the way most years do, quietly, one job bleeding into the next, one border crossed, and then another, until a life had been built not from choice but from accumulation, the way a hull gathers rust simply by existing in the wrong kind of air. Han Solo did not set out to become a legend. He set out, each morning, to survive the previous night's decisions, and if there was a shape to those years at all, it was the shape of a man running just fast enough to stay ahead of everything he owed. The Falcon became less a ship than a second body, and Chewbacca less a companion than an extension of Han's own nervous system. The two of them moving through the underworld's back corridors with the practiced silence of creatures who had learned, long ago, that survival favored those who spoke least and watched most. They ran spice through corporate sector checkpoints where a wrong glance meant a blaster in the ribs. They ferried refugees who could not afford passage and paid the difference themselves, though Han would have denied it under torture, calling it bad business rather than mercy, because mercy was a word for people who had not yet learned what mercy cost. They smuggled weapons for causes they did not believe in, and medicine for causes they did, and in the moral arithmetic of the underworld, the two were often indistinguishable, paid for in the same crumpled credits, delivered to the same desperate hands. Reputation, in that world, was currency more volatile than any coaxium, and Han's grew the way legends always grow, not through any single act of glory, but through repetition, through survival, through the slow accretion of stories told in cantinas by men who had not been there, but wished they had. He outran Imperial cruisers over Kessel a second time, then a third, each run shaving seconds and years off him in equal measure. He was shot more than once in places that never fully healed. He learned the names of 100 crime lords and the true names of none, because true names, he had learned early and would never forget, were the first thing worth losing, when the alternative was death. Beckett's lessons did not fade, they calcified, hardening into a private scripture Han recited without meaning to. Trust no one, expect betrayal, take the money and go, and if there was a cost to living by such scripture, it was one he did not let himself count. Not yet. Not while the counting could wait. Chewbacca alone remained constant. The one figure in that churn of faces and debts who did not need to be watched for the knife behind the smile. And in that friendship, wordless and absolute, Han kept something of himself intact that the rest of the galaxy seemed determined to erode. He grew wealthier and poorer in the same breath, richer in reputation and impoverished in belonging. A ghost with a fast ship and a long list of people who wanted either his help or his head. Somewhere in the tangle of those years, without ever choosing it, he became exactly what Corellia's gutters had once tried to make him into, and exactly what Beckett had warned him he might become. A man who took the job, said nothing of consequence, and vanished before the debt of caring could be called in. It was, by every measure that mattered to the underworld, a successful life. It was also, though he would not have said so aloud to any living soul, a lonely one, and loneliness, like debt, only compounds with time. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a decision made in half a second. The silence of a man listening to his own choice fall away behind him, like cargo dropped from a bay door, and it was in exactly such a silence that Han Solo's life changed course again. Though he would not understand the shape of that change, for years the run had begun as so many did, unremarkable. Another parcel of unrefined spice bound for a buyer who did not care to be named. Another quiet passage through space that belonged in theory to no one and, in practice, to the Empire whenever it chose to remember the fact. An Imperial cruiser found the Falcon where no cruiser should have been, dropping from hyperspace like a verdict already written, and there was, in that instant, no version of events in which Han Solo kept both the cargo and his freedom. He chose freedom. He always did. The spice went out the cargo hold in a long silver bloom, tumbling into the dark to be lost or found by someone else's fortune. And the Falcon screamed into the safety of hyperspace with its belly empty and its pilot's conscience, for once, entirely unbothered. It was a good decision. It was the only decision. It was also not his cargo to lose. The spice had belonged in the tangled ownership that governed such things to Jabba the Hutt, a crime lord whose patience was a rumor and whose memory was a certainty. And somewhere on Tatooine, in a palace of stone and smoke where fortunes were kept as carefully as grudges, the loss registered not as an accident of war, but as a debt, cold and exact, entered into a ledger that did not forgive circumstance. Han did not think of it as the beginning of anything. He thought of it, if he thought of it at all, as the cost of staying alive. A toll paid to fate for the privilege of another day's flying, and he told himself, in the easy grammar of a man used to outrunning consequence, that he would make it right eventually, that credits solved every problem the underworld could invent. He was not entirely wrong. He was not entirely right either. Jabba did not send assassins in the night. Not yet. Not for a debt this size. He simply waited, as ancient and patient things do, understanding better than Han ever would that debts, left alone, grow interest of their own accord, compounding in silence the way loneliness had compounded in Han's chest across all those unremarkable years. Word of the loss moved through the underworld the way all such words moved, quietly, without ceremony, passed between men who profited from knowing exactly who owed exactly what to exactly whom, and by the time it reached the ears that mattered, it had already calcified into legend of a smaller, meaner sort. Han Solo, the pilot who dumps his cargo when the Empire comes calling, the man who chooses his own skin over another's fortune every single time. It was not an unfair reputation. It was, if anything, precisely earned. But reputations, like debts, do not stay still. They travel ahead of a man into rooms he has not yet entered, arriving before he does to make promises on his behalf that he never intended to keep. And somewhere in a cantina thick with smoke and worse company, a bounty was already being discussed in low voices. A price already being imagined for the man who would, in time, become impossible to find and easier, everyone assumed, to simply erase. Han flew on, unaware or unwilling to be aware, chasing the next job and the next horizon with Chewbacca silent and steady at his side, the ship humming beneath them like a held breath, and for a while the debt slept, the way all patient things sleep, waiting for the hour when the galaxy itself would decide that the bill had finally come due. Mos Eisley did not welcome travelers so much as tolerate them, the way a wound tolerates the air. Obi-Wan Kenobi called it a wretched hive of scum and villainy, and he was not wrong, though even he could not have known how precisely the galaxy had arranged itself to bring an old hermit, a farm boy who did not yet know his own name in the annals of destiny, and a smuggler drowning slowly in debt into the same dim corner of the same forgotten cantina on the same unremarkable afternoon. Fate does not announce itself with fanfare. It arrives disguised as a job. Han Solo sat where he always sat, back to the wall, eyes on the door, Chewbacca a warm and watchful shadow beside him. And when the old man in the desert-worn robe approached, with the boy trailing after him like an unfinished sentence, Han did not know he was looking at the beginning of the end of everything he understood about himself. He only knew he needed money, and here improbably was money, wrapped in strange talk of the Force and Alderaan, and a need for passage that sounded reckless enough to be either very foolish or very important. And Han, ever the pragmatist, had long since stopped asking which. 22,000 simply for taking them to Alderaan. No questions, no cargo manifest. No complications beyond the obvious one, which was that imperial entanglements clung to old men like this, the way smoke clings to fire. He did not believe in the Force. He said so, flatly, the way a man states the boiling point of water, and Obi-Wan only looked at him with the serene patience of someone who had already seen how the story ends, and found no need to argue about its beginning. But before the deal could be sealed, before Han could even rise from the table, a green-skinned shape slid into the seat across from him, all nervous menace and rehearsed threat, and the cantina seemed to hold its breath the way it always did when Greedo appeared, because everyone knew what Greedo represented, even if they could not have named the debt itself. Jabba's patience, finally, audibly running out. Greedo spoke in his clicking, sibilant tongue of the cargo Han had dumped, of the price now attached to his continued breathing, and Han listened with the calm of a man who has rehearsed this exact conversation in his mind 100 times while lying awake in the Falcon's cramped bunk, already knowing, long before the blaster ever cleared the holster beneath the table, how it would end. There was no debate in that booth. There was no monologue, no last plea for mercy, no dramatic standoff stretched across minutes the way legend would later insist it must have been. There was only the quiet click of a weapon already drawn, already aimed, already decided, and then the flash and the silence after. Greedo slumping forward into the table with the anticlimax of all violence that has been inevitable from the start. Han rose, tossed a coin to the barkeep for the mess, and did not look back, because in his world, Mercy was a debt he could not afford to extend, and regret was a luxury reserved for men who believed the future held anything but more of the same. The old man did not flinch. That was the first thing Han noticed, before the robes, before the strange serenity that clung to him like dust that would not be brushed off, before the lightsaber hidden beneath a cloak that had seen too many years and too many roads. A blaster had gone off inches away. A man had died in the space of a breath, and the old man had not so much as turned his head, as if the violence had happened in some other room, some other galaxy, some story that did not concern him. Han filed it away the way he filed away everything useful and everything strange, and did not yet understand that the two piles were, in this man's case, the same pile. Obi-Wan Kenobi, he called himself, though the name meant nothing to Han beyond a stranger's price on a stranger's passage. And the boy beside him, Luke, wore the look of someone who had not yet learned that the galaxy rarely rewards hope with anything but bruises. They spoke, on the long walk back to the ship, of an ancient religion, a mystical energy field that bound all living things, that could be felt, wielded, trusted. And Han listened the way he listened to street preachers on Corellia, peddling salvation to children who had already learned that salvation cost more than it gave. Hokey religions, he called it, and ancient weapons, no match for a good blaster at your side. And he said it not with cruelty, but with the flat certainty of a man reciting a lesson beaten into him by every year of his life since the shipyards, since Chira's hand slipping from his in the crush of a crowd, since a mentor's parting bullet, since a woman he loved choosing a throne over him. Kid, he thought, though he did not say it aloud, you'll learn there's no mystical energy field that controls my destiny. It's all a lot of simple tricks and nonsense. Obi-Wan only smiled at that, the small, patient smile of a man who has heard disbelief 1,000 times and buried it 1,000 times beside older, larger griefs, and said nothing in response but the quiet, unbothered kind of nothing that unsettles more than argument ever could. In another life, Han might have recognized something of himself in that stillness. The same stillness Beckett had worn while lying. The same stillness Kira had worn while choosing. But Han was not yet a man who looked for himself in strangers. And so the moment passed as so many moments do, unremarked, unweighed, filed under things that did not matter. And yet something in him noted, without permission, that the old man's calm was not the calm of ignorance, but the calm of someone who had already made peace with an ending he could see and Han could not. And though Han would have laughed at the suggestion that a Jedi's faith might one day outweigh a smuggler's certainty, the galaxy, as it so often does, was already writing the correction into the years ahead, patient as debt, patient as fate, waiting for the boy who trusted no one to meet the one man whose trust could not be shaken, and to wonder, if only for a moment, before wondering became belief, before belief became something closer to love. The Death Star did not look like a weapon from a distance. It looked like a moon, a gray and pitted sphere hanging in the dark, with the false serenity of something ancient and celestial, and it was only up close, only when the Falcon was pulled into its gravity like a moth into a lantern's mouth, that the illusion broke and the thing revealed itself for what it was, a hollow god built to end worlds, and already it had. Alderaan was gone. Han did not fully understand what that meant, not yet. Not in the way Leia understood it or Obi-Wan understood it, but he understood the silence that followed its mention, and he understood that some silences are heavier than shouting. They were pulled aboard, discovered, and for a handful of frantic, breathless hours, the smuggler's instincts that had kept Han alive since the gutters of Corellia took over entirely, thinking only in exits and angles and the next half-second of survival, because that was the only language fear had ever taught him fluently. Stormtrooper armor was stolen. Corridors were run. A princess was found in a detention block, sharp-tongued and unimpressed by rescue, which amused Han in spite of himself. A flicker of something almost like delight in the middle of catastrophe. But it was in the quiet after, in the moment Obi-Wan slipped away from the group, with the unhurried calm of a man walking toward something he had already accepted, that the day's shape changed. Han did not understand what the old man was doing, disappearing alone into the station's depths while the others ran for the ship, and he did not ask, because asking was not something Han did. Not yet. Not for strangers. He would understand later. He would spend years understanding later. They reached the Falcon. They ran. And it was only through the transparent viewport, only in that suspended half-second between escape and grief, that Han saw it, a lightsaber raised, a black-cloaked shape mirroring it, two figures locked in a duel that looked less like combat and more like liturgy, slow and deliberate and terribly, terribly final. He watched Obi-Wan lower his blade. He watched him vanish, robes collapsing into nothing, the body gone before it could fall. And for one disorienting instant, Han's mind refused the sight entirely, filed it under trick, under illusion, under anything but true. Because a man could not simply stop being there. Not like that. Not so gently. Luke screamed the old man's name into the corridor, and Han felt something crack quietly beneath his ribs that he did not have a name for, and would not have named even if he did. He had watched men die before. He had caused a few of those deaths himself beneath cantina tables, in the mud of unnamed wars, and none of it had ever felt like this specific, senseless, awful stillness. And it occurred to him, distantly, unwillingly, that perhaps the old man's calm had never been about ignorance of death at all, but about walking toward it on his own terms, which was a kind of freedom Han did not yet have language for. He did not cry. He couldn't. Grief was a language his childhood had never taught him fluently, and so he did what he always did. What Beckett had taught him, and Corellia had taught him before that, he flew. He got them out. He did his job. But somewhere beneath the practiced calm, beneath the pilot's hands steady on the controls, a small and unfamiliar ache had lodged itself, quiet as a splinter, and it would not leave him, not for a long time, not even after the credits were counted, and the ship was fueled, and the galaxy, indifferent as always, moved on to its next disaster. The reward, when it came, was substantial, enough to clear a debt that had followed him for years like a shadow with teeth, enough to buy a little peace, a little distance from the kind of men who collected on behalf of Jabba the Hutt with knives instead of ledgers. Han counted it twice, out of habit rather than doubt, and told himself that this was the end of it, that he had done what he came to do, flown the girl and the boy and the old man's ghost to wherever they needed to be, and that the rest of it, the war, the cause, the rebellion with its earnest speeches and its doomed arithmetic, was none of his concern. He had never belonged to anything. Not to Corellia, not to the White Worms, not to the Empire that had cast him out into the mud, not even. in the end to Beckett, whose lessons he carried like scars rather than gifts. Belonging was a debt paid in blood, and Han Solo had learned early and hard that the safest thing a man could do was owe nothing to anyone. And yet there was Luke, insufferable, earnest Luke, standing in the Massassi temple with his father's blaster and his dead aunt and uncle still fresh in his eyes, asking Han to stay, not with words exactly, but with the particular silence of someone who has already decided you will say no and is bracing for it anyway. And there was Leia, who did not ask at all, who looked at him the way generals look at deserters, which was somehow worse than anger. Han told himself he did not care what either of them thought. He told himself this several times, in the cockpit of the Falcon, credits stacked beside him, engines humming with the low patient sound of a ship ready to leave and never look back. Chewbacca said nothing, which was its own kind of argument, the way silence between old companions often is. Han flew them out of the hangar and into the dark, and for a long while he did not speak, and neither did Chewbacca, and the stars slid past the viewport, indifferent to the small war being fought inside one smuggler's chest. He thought of Obi-Wan walking toward Vader's blade without flinching, and hated how much the memory had followed him. He thought of Beckett's voice, low and certain, trust no one, look out for yourself. The galaxy owes you nothing and will take everything if you let it. He thought, unbidden, of Chira, of every door that had ever closed behind him when he was too slow, too proud, too alone to reach for something before it vanished. He did not think of himself as a man capable of turning around. And then, somewhere in the dark between escape and safety, he did. It was not a decision made in words. There was no lightning, no revelation, no voice from some ancient force to guide his hand. There was only the quiet, stubborn recognition that he had spent his whole life running from things that mattered, because it was easier than losing them, and that running, this time, would cost him something he did not yet have a name for. Chewbacca looked at him. Han looked back. Neither of them said it aloud, because it did not need saying. He brought the Falcon around, slow and certain, and pointed her back toward the fire. The Battle of Yavin would be remembered by history as a miracle, a single torpedo threading an impossible needle, an empire's arrogance undone by a farm boy from a desert no one had ever bothered to conquer. But history, as it so often does, would forget the smaller miracles that made the larger one possible. The quiet returns, the unspoken debts repaid, the smugglers who came back not for glory, but because some door inside them, long rusted shut, had finally creaked open. Han Solo would never call what he did that day heroism. He would call it, if pressed, a mistake, an aberration, a temporary lapse in judgment, brought on by too little sleep and too much proximity to idealists. But the Falcon returned, and the Falcon fired, and Vader's wings scattered like ash before a wind no one had seen coming, and somewhere in the wreckage of that victory, something in Han shifted that would never quite shift back. He told himself it was a one-time thing. He told Chewbacca the same, in low Corellian mutters that even the Wookiee did not believe. The rebellion, in its threadbare joy, its exhausted cheering in the corridors of a base that still smelled of engine coolant and fear, did not care what Han told himself. They only knew he had come back, and in the arithmetic of desperate causes, that was enough to earn him a place, however uneasy, at their fires. Leia gave him a look that night that he would spend the rest of his life trying to name. something between gratitude and challenge, as though she had expected exactly this of him and resented him faintly for taking so long to prove her right. Luke, still hollowed by the deaths of the only family he had known, clung to Han's presence the way the drowning cling to driftwood, not because it was solid, but because it was there, and warm, and alive, and asking nothing of him but that he keep breathing. Han did not know how to be needed like that. He had spent a lifetime training himself out of it, ever since Corellia, ever since the door of the ship that left without Chira, ever since Beckett's voice had taught him that need was a leash, and leashes were how the galaxy caught you. And yet, the days folded into weeks, and the weeks folded into something dangerously close to belonging, and Han found himself, again and again, in briefing rooms he had no reason to attend, on transport ships he had no reason to fly, at Leia's shoulder in arguments about strategy he pretended not to care about the outcome of. He told Chewbacca it was the money. He told himself it was the money. The money, by then, had long since stopped being the reason, and some quiet, buried part of him knew it. The way a man knows a wound has closed over even as he keeps checking the bandage. Around him, the rebellion itself was a fragile, half-built thing, a coalition of the desperate and the principled bound together by nothing sturdier than shared enemies and stolen time, its command structure thin, its resources thinner, its hope thinner still, and yet it held, the way certain flowers hold through frost, stubborn and improbable, and entirely unwilling to acknowledge how easily it could all be undone. Han watched it hold. He watched Leia carry grief for a lost home with a spine of durasteel. He watched Luke reach, again and again, for something vast and unnameable he did not yet have words for, some early tremor of the Force, finding its way into a boy who did not know yet what he was becoming. Han did not believe in that mystical current, not truly, not yet. But he began, despite himself, to believe in the two people it moved through, and belief, once it takes root, does not ask permission before it grows. It would not be long before that fragile hope was tested again, before ice and betrayal and the cold architecture of carbonite would come to claim what these quiet months had built. But for now, in the brief hush between one battle and the next, Han Solo remained, unrooted still, but no longer quite so alone. The hush did not last. It never does. Somewhere in the frozen dark of an ice planet called Hoth, the rebellion's brief exhale ended, and the Empire found them, as it always found them, as if doom itself kept a ledger of hiding places and crossed each one off in turn. The alarms came first, then the walkers, vast and insectile against the white horizon, striding through the snow like gods indifferent to the ants beneath their feet, and the base that had felt like a home, however borrowed, however temporary, became one more ruin to flee. Han flew the Falcon low through the chaos, hauling frightened technicians and half-finished plans out of a base collapsing into fire and frost, and somewhere in that desperate exodus, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the cramped hold of a ship that had never once, in all its long, unglamorous life, been built for tenderness, Han and Leia found each other in a way neither had permitted before. It was not romance in the old easy sense. It was two people who had each spent years refusing to be held, discovering, almost against their will, that they wanted, briefly, to be held anyway. Words were sparse between them, as they always are in stories like this one, but a look lingered where a sentence might have failed, and a hand found another hand in the dark of a malfunctioning ship, and for a moment even the war seemed to soften around the edges of that fragile, unspoken thing. It would not be given long to breathe. Nothing given to Han Solo ever was. The Falcon, wounded and half-blind, fled toward the only safe harbor left to it, a floating city named Bespin, ruled by a face from an old life, a friend once wagered, and won and never quite forgiven for the manner of his losing. Lando Calrissian received them with the old theater of charm, the cape, the smile, the practiced warmth of a man who had built an empire of style atop a foundation of careful self-interest, and Han, weary and hunted, let himself believe, one more time, that an old friend's welcome could still mean shelter. It could not. Vader was already there, waiting in marble halls gone cold with menace, a shadow given shape and breath, the Empire's long reach closing around a city that had thought itself neutral, thought itself safe, the way all cities do before they learn otherwise. Lando was given no true choice, only the illusion of one. The kind tyrants have always offered the desperate, betray, and something might be spared. Refuse, and everything burns. He chose, as frightened men so often do, the smaller mercy over the larger loyalty, and told himself, perhaps, that he would find some way to undo it after. Han did not know, not yet, that the floor beneath him had already been sold. He walked into a chamber built for testing, not for talk, a pit of pipes and steam and cold industrial light, and there he found a device never meant for men, a carbonite freezing chamber built to preserve cargo, not people, built to answer a question Vader wished answered, before he risked his true prize, the boy, upon it. Leia screamed his name as the platform began its descent. Han looked at her once, only once, and there was no time left for the words either of them might have chosen. So he offered instead the only ones that fit a moment with no future tense left in it. "I love you," she said, quiet and certain, as if daring fate to prove her wrong. "I know," he answered, "not brave, not clever, simply true, and truth, in the end, was the only inheritance he had left to give her." Then the freezing gas rose, white and merciless, and Han Solo, scoundrel, smuggler, reluctant hero, was taken by ice and silence, entombed alive in cold black stone, his fate unknown even to those who loved him. His story paused mid-sentence, the cycle of trust and betrayal closing once more around a man who had only just begun to believe he might, after all, belong to someone. There is a kind of death that leaves no body to mourn, and a kind of life that leaves no breath to prove it. Han Solo existed, in those years, in the narrow country between the two, a man reduced to a shape inside a shape, his mind stilled to something less than dreaming, his heart slowed to something less than beating. Carbonite does not kill. It merely refuses to let a man finish. It takes the sentence of a life and leaves it hanging, unpunctuated, and holds it there, patient as stone, indifferent as the void between stars. Somewhere in that suspended dark, if dark can be said to hold a somewhere at all, Han Solo was neither alive nor dead, neither present nor gone, a man unmade into an object, hauled and shipped and sold like the very cargo he had once smuggled across 100 lawless skies. There is a bitter symmetry in that, though no one living was there to remark upon it. The smuggler became the smuggled. The one who ran from every debt was carried, silent and unresisting, directly into the arms of the debt he owed. Jabba the Hutt, patient as only the powerful can afford to be, received him not as a man but as a trophy, a slab of black stone mounted upon a wall of other failures, other warnings, other men who had once believed themselves too clever to be caught. Han hung there in Jabba's palace the way a lesson hangs in a temple, meant to be looked upon, not heard, and there is no way to speak of what he felt in that frozen span, because feeling itself had been suspended along with breath and blood, and yet the galaxy insisted on turning without him. Battles were fought, and men died in them. Rebellions faltered and found their footing again. Children were born who would grow old before that block of carbonite ever cracked open. Time did not stop for Han Solo. Time simply left without him, the way it always does, indifferent to the particular tragedies of particular men, and somewhere far away on world after world, the people who loved him carried a grief with no funeral to close it, no body to bury, no ending to grant them permission to heal. That is the cruelest shape captivity can take, crueler even than pain, crueler even than death, not the ending of a story, but its indefinite suspension, a wound that will not scar because it is never allowed to close. Leia carried that wound into war rooms and briefings and the cold hush of command, learning to lead a fractured rebellion while some part of her remained standing on a platform on Bespin, watching gas rise white around a man who had just told her, wordlessly, that he already knew. Lando carried his own version of that wound, guilt wearing the shape of a debt he could never fully repay, and in the years that followed he would search for ways to become. Again, the man Han had once mistaken for a friend worth trusting, and Han himself, wherever the self of a frozen man resides, carried nothing at all, because there was nothing left in him to carry. He was legend now, more than man, hearsay traded in cantinas, a name spoken with a shrug or a curse or, in rare and quiet company, something close to hope. The scoundrel who vanished, the smuggler who owed too much and paid for it in ice. But legends, unlike men, do not stay silent forever. Somewhere, beneath the frost and the stillness, a heart that had once dared to believe it belonged to someone was still technically beating, waiting for a hand it did not yet know was already reaching for it. The hand that reached for him did not come dressed as a princess. It came disguised, as all true loyalty eventually must, in the shape of someone the world would not think to fear. She called herself Bouche, a bounty hunter of grim reputation, voice modulated into something guttural and alien, armor heavy and anonymous, and beneath the mask, unseen by the slug lord she meant to deceive, Leia Organa carried a plan built entirely from memory and grief. She had crossed star systems for this. She had traded the comfort of command, the safety of distance, for a single desperate gamble inside the walls of a palace that smelled of rot and sweet drug and old violence. Jabba's throne room was a cathedral of decay, lit by torchlight and the phosphorescent glow of alien creatures kept as pets and punishments alike, and at its heart, mounted like an idol upon the wall, hung the block of carbonite that had once been a man. Frozen mid-cry, his face locked in the last agony of transformation, Han Solo had become furniture in another creature's kingdom, an ornament of someone else's cruelty. And for a long moment even Leia, who had rehearsed this in silence 1,000 times, found she could not look away. She waited. She endured Jabba's leering attention, his oily amusement, the small indignities a queen must swallow to become a thief in someone else's house. And when the hour came, when the palace slept its half-sleep of debauchery and guards grew careless, she found the control panel hidden beneath years of dust and pressed the sequence that would either save him or kill him trying. There was no ceremony to it, no trumpet, no light, only a low mechanical groan, ancient machinery, waking after too long a sleep. And then the carbonite began to fall away in sheets, hissing steam that curled up around a body, remembering, cell by cell, how to be alive. Han did not wake gently. He woke the way drowning men surface, all at once, gasping air that felt like knives, his limbs betraying him, refusing at first to answer any command his mind still barely remembered how to give. His eyes opened onto absolute blindness, a darkness so complete it seemed a second death, and for one terrible moment the galaxy's most notorious scoundrel believed, with quiet and total certainty, that he had been thawed only to die properly this time, alone, unseeing, forgotten. He did not know where he was. He did not know who stood before him. He asked, voice a ruined rasp dragged up from years of silence, whether he was still alive at all, unable yet to trust the answer his own senses refused to give him. And when the voice that answered him was familiar, warm, trembling with restrained relief beneath the modulated static of a disguise she had not yet dropped, something in him settled, even blind, even lost, even hollowed out by frost and time. He could not see her. He did not need to. Loyalty, it turned out, had a shape that did not require eyes to recognize, a debt repaid not in credits or blaster fire, but in someone crossing half a galaxy to remind a frozen man that he still, against every reasonable expectation the universe had given him, mattered to somebody. The rescue from Jabba's palace would pass into legend of its own accord, a tale of a rancor's dying roar, of a barge burning above the dune sea, of a Hutt's throat closing beneath the very chain he had used to leash his prisoners for pleasure. But that is a story for another fire, another night. What matters here, what the galaxy would remember long after the sand had settled and the names of lesser gangsters had faded from memory, is that Han Solo walked away from Tatooine alive, sight restored, legs unsteady but his own again, and that he walked away beside people who had crossed unimaginable distance simply because they refused to let him go. He did not have time to dwell on gratitude. The war had not paused to wait for him. Somewhere beyond the twin suns, in shipyards and command bunkers and the trembling hearts of a rebellion that had spent years bleeding for inches, a new terror was already rising to replace the old, vast and spherical and humming with the same cold appetite that had swallowed a planet once before and called it a demonstration. The Empire, it seemed, did not believe in learning from its ashes. It only believed in building bigger ones. A second Death Star hung now above the forest moon of Endor, unfinished, guarded, waiting to become the final punctuation mark on the rebellion's long and desperate sentence, and against it the Alliance would gather what remained of its hope, its fighters, its faith, and throw all of it forward in one last, unreasonable act of defiance. Han was given command of a strike team, a ragged assortment of soldiers and smugglers, and one very large, very loyal Wookiee, tasked with reaching the shield generator hidden on the moon's surface before the fleet above could be annihilated by a shield they could not see and could not survive. He did not ask why it had to be him. He already knew. Some debts are paid in credits, and some are paid by standing where the fire is worst so that others do not have to. On Endor, among trees older than the Empire itself, among a people small and strange and unexpectedly fierce, the battle was fought not with grand fleets alone, but with knives, with courage, with an improbable alliance between soldiers and furred natives who had no reason to bleed for a war that was not theirs, and yet did gladly, because kindness had been offered where cruelty was expected. The generator fell. The shield came down. Above the moon, in the black theater of vacuum and starlight, the fleet surged forward into the newly opened wound in the Empire's defense, and the second Death Star, still unfinished, still humming with unfulfilled dread, was undone from within by a single stolen ship and a single desperate gambit flown by Lando Calrissian himself. Guilt transmuted at last into something like redemption, guiding the very vessel Han had once won from him in a game of cards into the heart of the enemy's design. Below, on the forest floor, Han watched the sky ignite, a false dawn of fire blooming silent and terrible where a battle station the size of a moon had been, and he felt no triumph in it, not truly, only a vast and hollow relief, the kind that comes only after the worst has been outrun rather than defeated. Around him, small bodies lay unmoving in the ash and the ferns, natives and soldiers alike, who would not rise to celebrate what their deaths had purchased. Victory, when it finally came, tasted less like wine and more like the ash still drifting down through the canopy, settling on shoulders and hair and closed eyes, and somewhere far above, in a chamber none of them could see, a sun had turned from darkness at the cost of his father's life, though Han would not learn the shape of that particular grief until much later, when the celebrations of Endor's bonfires had long since burned to embers, and Luke returned to them changed, older, quieter, carrying a silence that no victory party could touch. The Empire was broken that night, its emperor, its enforcer, its terrible engine of fear, all of it undone in a single stroke of fire and family and forgiveness. But every ending, the wise have always said, is only the seed of what comes next, and even as the forest moon rang with drums and laughter and the disbelieving joy of the truly exhausted, somewhere in the wreckage of that dying regime the shape of tomorrow's sorrow was already being drawn, patient, unseen, waiting for its hour. Peace, when it finally arrived, did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept in slowly, the way dawn creeps over a battlefield uncertain of its welcome, and for a time the galaxy simply exhaled and let itself believe. Han Solo, who had spent a lifetime running from anything that resembled permanence, found himself, in those strange bright years, standing still. It did not suit him, not at first. He had been built by loss and motion, shaped by every door he had ever closed behind him, and there was a part of him that flinched at the quiet the way other men flinch at noise. But there was Leia. There had always, in some sense, been Leia, from the moment on the Death Star when a princess in chains had looked at a smuggler with more scorn than gratitude. And something in him had recognized, even then, an equal. They married in a ceremony smaller than her title might have demanded, and larger than his history deserved. An old smuggler and a princess of a world turned to ash, and if anyone thought it strange, no one dared say so aloud. Chewbacca stood beside him, as he always had, as he always would. Luke stood near, quieter now, carrying the weight of a destiny he had only begun to understand. It was, by every account that survives, a rare and unguarded happiness, the kind the galaxy had not permitted itself in a generation. And then came Ben. His birth was greeted the way starlight is greeted in the deepest cold of space, a small and fragile brilliance against an immensity that did not care whether it lived or died. Han held his son and felt for the first time in his life a fear that had nothing to do with blasters or bounty hunters or the cold vacuum beyond a hull. It was the fear of loving something too much to protect it. Leia felt it too, though neither said it aloud. Not yet. Not for years. The boy was strong in the Force, stronger perhaps than his uncle, and there was already, even in his infancy, something watchful in his eyes, something that unsettled those who looked too closely. He was gentle, and he was loved, and he was theirs, and none of that would be enough. For a time, the family lived inside a fragile architecture of normalcy. Leia building a fractured new republic from the wreckage of the old, Han drifting between duty and the old restlessness that never fully left him, Luke vanishing for long stretches into the study of powers even he did not fully trust. Ben grew in the spaces between them, in the long silences of a father who did not know how to stay, and a mother who did not know how to rest. And if there was neglect, it was not born of cruelty, only of the particular exhaustion of people who had given everything to a war and had precious little left over for the slow, unglamorous work of raising a child. Somewhere in the marrow of the galaxy, old patterns stirred, patient as they always were, waiting for a vessel young enough to not yet know their name. Han did not see it coming. No one ever does. He only knew, in the small hours when he watched his son sleep, that something ancient and hungry seemed at times to watch back. There is a particular cruelty reserved for those who survive one war only to raise a child for another. And it is this: they mistake the quiet for peace. Luke Skywalker, who had once been the last hope of a dying order, believed he could build a new one from its ashes, a school for the gifted and the strange, a sanctuary for children touched by the Force before the galaxy could touch them first. He believed this the way all builders believe, with the particular blindness of men who have already seen one temple fall and think themselves wiser for it. Ben Solo was sent to him young, sent away from the home that could not hold him, and if Han told himself it was for the boy's own good, he did not examine that thought too closely, because beneath it lived a smaller, uglier truth that he had never known what to do with a son who looked at him and seemed already to understand more than his father ever would. Under his uncle's care, Ben trained. He was gifted, frighteningly so, the kind of talent that made old masters. Had any still lived, whisper of prophecy and balance, and all the words that had once been draped over another boy from a desert world, a boy who became a man, who became a legend, who became, in the end, a myth too heavy for anyone to carry cleanly. History does not repeat by accident. It repeats because no one is ever taught to recognize the shape of its return until it is standing in the room with them. Ben carried his grandfather's blood, though he had never been told, not truly, not with the weight it deserved. And blood such as that does not stay silent. It calls. It called to him in dreams he did not describe to his mother, in a voice that was patient and reasonable, and endlessly kind in the particular way that only cruelty learns to be kind, promising him strength where he had only ever been given expectation, promising him certainty where his family had only ever given him distance, dressed as love. There was a man behind that voice, a shepherd of broken things who called himself Snoke, though even that name would prove to be borrowed, a mask over a mask, and under his patient cultivation the boy's loneliness was reshaped, slowly, the way water reshapes stone, into something that could be pointed like a weapon. Luke saw it too late. He always did, and it was not weakness, it was simply the oldest wound of every mentor who has ever lived. To love a student is to sometimes fail to see them clearly. What happened between them in that dim room on the night the temple burned would be told in 100 different ways by 100 different mourners, and none of the tellings would agree. Except in this, a lightsaber was raised. A decision was made in half, a heartbeat that would echo for the rest of both their lives. And when the fire finished, Luke Skywalker was alone amid the ruin of everything he had built, and Ben Solo was gone, and something else, calling itself Kylo Ren, had risen in the ash to take his place. Han heard of it the way men hear of earthquakes on worlds they no longer live on, second-hand, incomplete, arriving already as legend rather than fact. He did not go to his son. He did not know how. He went instead to the Falcon, to Chewbacca, to the old scoundrel's life he had never fully surrendered, because it was easier, infinitely easier, to run from a grief that had a face than to stay and look at it. Leia stayed and built and grieved in the particular silence of leaders who are not permitted the luxury of falling apart in public, and somewhere out past the reach of both of them, in the cold architecture of a new order rising from an old one's bones, their son knelt before a master who was not their equal, and told himself, the way every fallen thing tells itself, that this, finally, was strength. Come then to the bridge. Every story of Han Solo has been leading here, though he did not know it, though perhaps some part of him always did, the way a man who has spent his whole life running from a debt somehow always ends up standing before the one who is owed it. Starkiller Base was not a place so much as a wound, a world hollowed out and filled with machinery built to devour suns. And Han walked its length with Chewbacca at his shoulder, and Leia's voice still warm in his ear, telling him what he already knew, what he had always known, and never said aloud, that if there was still light in their son, he was the one who had to find it, because he was the one who had left first. He did not think of himself as brave. Bravery, to Han, had always been a young man's word, a word for people who had not yet learned what it cost. He thought only of Ben, not Kylo Ren, never Kylo Ren, not to Han, not in the small, true chamber of his heart, where his son had only ever been a boy who laughed at his jokes and hated his absences in equal measure. The bridge stretched out over an abyss of machinery and dark, wind screaming up from below like something grieving, and there at its center waited the shape of a man in black, masked, still, unmoving, as though he had been carved from the same cold metal as the world around him. Han stopped a dozen paces away, close enough to speak, far enough still to pretend there was distance left to close. Ben, he said. Just that. A name, worn smooth by years of not being spoken, offered now like a hand extended across a canyon that might still be crossed. The mask turned toward him, and when the voice came, it came changed, deepened, machine-filtered, but underneath it, unmistakably, impossibly, still a boy's voice, thin and uncertain beneath all that armor of choice. "I'm being torn apart," Kylo Ren said, and it was the truest thing he had said in years, and Han, hearing it, felt something in his chest crack open like old ice, giving way beneath a long-forgotten weight. "I know what I have to do, but I don't know if I have the strength to do it. Will you help me?" There are moments in every legend when the listener wants desperately to reach into the story and change what comes next, to reach through years and stars and grab the hand before it moves. And this was one of those moments. And it did no good then, and it will do no good now, because some things, once set in motion by galaxies and gods and grief, cannot be unmade by wanting. "Yes," Han said. "Anything." And he crossed the distance. He reached up, slowly the way a father reaches for a child who has grown too tall to be lifted, but not, never, too old to be held. And he removed the mask, and beneath it was his son's face, older than it should have been, marked by sorrow in ways no father should ever have to witness on a child he once carried on his shoulders. For one breath, one single suspended breath in the roaring dark, there was no war, no order, no darkness, only a father and a son looking at each other across all the years neither of them had known how to close. Han touched his son's face. Ben's hand found the hilt of his own blade. The blade ignited. Han did not step back. He did not flinch. He looked into his son's eyes with a tenderness that held no fear in it at all, and Ben Solo, or Kylo Ren, or whatever remained fused of the two, drove the blade forward, and Han Solo fell into the abyss below the bridge without a sound, and above him, his son stood alone in the wind with his father's blood cooling on a blade forged for killing gods, and somewhere far off. Chewbacca screamed a grief too vast for words, and the galaxy, indifferent as always to the small deaths of great men, kept turning. Come closer now, one last time, and let the fire burn low. You have traveled far tonight, across shipyards of rust and cantinas of smoke, through the mad churn of the Kessel Run and the long silence of carbonite, through betrayals and reunions and 1,000 small choices that added, in the end, to something the galaxy would call a legend. It is nearly finished. Rest a little longer, and let it finish gently. Han Solo did not die a hero in the way the old songs promise heroes their deaths, wreathed in trumpets and banners and the clean grief of armies. He died quietly on a bridge no wider than a man's outstretched arms, in the freezing dark of a world built only to end other worlds, killed by the one heart he had crossed galaxies and years to save. There was no monument raised that night. There was only a wound, and a scream that belonged to a Wookiee who had loved him longer than anyone alive, and a girl turned general far away who felt something break inside her before the news ever reached her lips. And yet, the story did not end there, because stories like his never do. He had begun as a nameless child on the shipyards of Corellia, hungry, unclaimed, unrecorded in any ledger that mattered, and he had ended as a name spoken in reverence across 100 worlds, in cantinas and rebel barracks and children's bedtime tales, not so unlike this one. That is the strange alchemy of legend. It does not require a clean death, only an honest life, lived loudly enough that its echo outlasts the echo of the blaster that ends it. Consider the shape of it, dear listener, the whole arc from beginning to end. A boy who wanted only to be free, who found love and lost it, who found it again older and changed, who chained himself to no cause and no code, and yet gave everything, in the final accounting, to a cause and a family he swore he never wanted. He was, in this way, no different from the fallen masters and broken orders who came before him, no different from mentors who taught trust only to break it, no different from empires who rose in glory and rotted quietly from within. The galaxy's history, it seems, prefers to rhyme rather than repeat exactly. And so it did again. A father lost to a son's blade, an old wound reopened in new flesh, the same shape of tragedy, wearing a different face, as it always has, as perhaps it always will. Kylo Ren walked on after that night, carrying a grief he could not name, and a darkness he had not yet finished becoming. And whether redemption waited for him somewhere further down that black road is a story for another night, another fire, another telling. But Han himself needs no further chapters, because his legend had already been written in the small. Unglamorous truths of his life, that a scoundrel can still choose loyalty, that a man who trusts no one can still love completely, that freedom and belonging are not opposites but two halves of the same aching heart. Smugglers still speak his name over card tables from the Corellian sector to the far outer rim, half in myth, half in memory, and no one quite agrees on how much of the legend is true, and it hardly matters, because that is what legend is for. So close your eyes now, dear listener, and let the Falcon's hum carry you outward into your own quiet dark, past mist and ruin and blood-red moons, past the long silence between the stars, and know that somewhere among all that indifferent, turning galaxy, a story like his is always beginning again in some other gutter, under some other sky, waiting only for a name. Sleep now. The cycle continues, as it always does, but you need not carry it tonight. Rest, dear one. The story will still be here when you wake.